Good evening, everyone. And first, thank you for coming. And also, thank you to the Institute and Graham for the kind invitation to talk to you tonight. I have listed some past and present affiliations there, but I should stress I'm talking in my own right tonight. I'm not talking on behalf of any of the bodies that are listed there. This presentation is a bit of a guilt trip. Let me just explain why. I spent many happy years working for the Institute of Directors, trotting around the country, including down to this part of the country, exhorting directors and organisation to take out stock, to run lean, and so on, all of which was necessary for their survival. But there was one kind of ghost at that feast. If you take out stock, if you run lean, you do increase your dependency on everything else working underneath you, like the infrastructure. And I'm afraid at the same time as we were telling people to take out stock and run lean, in many ways we were weakening the infrastructure. And by taking out stock and running lean, we'd weakened organisations' ability to cope with infrastructure failure. And so that, if you like, is the backdrop to what I'd like to talk to you about tonight. So I'd like to share some thoughts with you and to debate with you. That's absolutely fine. But I'm going to start first with a story. It's a fable about exponential growth. Human beings don't relate well to exponential growth. They think in linear terms, not exponential terms. And I'm going to argue it lies at the root of many of the problems we're now facing. Second, I'd like to illustrate that big failures do actually happen. Third, to emphasize just how important action now is. Then to explore the, if you like, the real challenge of linkages between different areas of the infrastructure that we don't always anticipate. So when one piece fails, a cascade of failures in others. Fifth, I want to actually recognise that a lot of good work has been done. And actually the UK is a pretty good place in this respect, but there's still a lot more to do. And sixth, to share with you this point about is there a good understanding of resilience. Research I did at the IOD showed that for many organisations, their assumptions about what would fail in a resilient situation were 100% wrong, which is kind of a bad basis on which to plan. And seventh, I want to just explore a potential way forward. So moving on. I want to start with that fable. And it's not true, of course, it is a fable. But as some of my friends in the press used to say before Leveson, why confuse a good story with the truth anyway? And this is a fable set in the court of the Emperor of China, round about the year 600 AD. Any colleagues here from the Indian subcontinent will immediately disagree, but let's put that on one side. But the story is about the invention of chess. And for those who've heard it before, I apologise, but it's such a good story to illustrate what I want to cover. So, in the fable, chess is invented by a court functionary, in my terms, a civil servant. And the emperor is delighted by chess and does a very, very dangerous thing. He asks the court functionary what he would like as his reward. In the fable, the court functionary says, "O emperor, 1 grain of rice on the first square, 2 on the second, and just keep doubling every square till you get to the end of the board." Again, in the fable, the emperor is not a mathematician and doesn't realise that is not a very wise thing to commit to. So he agrees. Now, the horrible truth sets in when you get about halfway across the chessboard. I'm reliably assured that for square 32, the amount of rice you need is roughly an area of central London would do it, or greater London would do it. By the time you get to square 64, anyone like to guess what the surface area you need is to grow that amount of rice? It's not a fair question, by the way. But okay, it's 2.5 times the entire surface area of the planet, including all the oceans. Right? This is about exponential growth. There's a nice piece in the fable, because in the fable at about square 32, the emperor works out he's been had and orders the execution of the court functionary. I did have a spell in what became the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit, and I did tell this to some ministers in Tony Blair's government round about 1999. And you could see a sort of wistful look in their eye when you got to the executing the civil servant bit. Anyhow, so what has this got to do with tonight? Well, this is the very familiar Moore's law. Cost performance of electronics doubles every 20 months. We're now pretty much on square 38 on that chessboard, so we're well into the second half where things get interesting. And by the way, it's showing no particular sign of stopping soon. It's illustrated here. I updated this slide a year ago. At that stage, 18 nanometer features were just coming into production. Sorry, at that stage it was 22 nanometers. It's now down to 18 nanometers. The target is 5. Beyond a feature size of 5 times 10 to the minus 9 meters, things get a little difficult. So not to worry, we just add more processors on the same chip. Right? There's an interesting vulnerability actually that comes from it. As the feature size goes down, so do the number of people who can make it. So you get a whole new vulnerability. And there's a nice story here because the big challenger in this space is actually a company called Global Foundries, which bought Associated AMD. Now, Global Foundries is owned by Abu Dhabi. So we've got the Arabs moving out of oil into sand, or at least in this case, silicon. But by the way, it's not just electronics. This is transmission using optical fibers. I long ago stopped trying to update this graph because actually at the moment optical transmission is trebling in cost performance every 8 months. Think about that. This is astounding. And if we do one more, this is dear old magnetic storage, a pretty old technology. It's still doubling every 18 months and it's only reached square 31. It's getting there. One more. This is because I happen to be a former radio spectrum regulator for the UK, so I couldn't resist it. The straight line is a bit of a liberty, starting with Marconi in 1895. What that one is about is exploitation. So that's the intensity of exploitation of the radio spectrum in anywhere, but the UK will do nicely, which doubles every 2.5 years. And the Wi-Fi you have in this lecture theatre, the 4G mobile phones you're promised coming soon, the 5G in 5 years' time, and so on, are just examples of that continuing change. And that's not going to stop anytime soon either. So, my argument is that as a society, we're not actually very good at handling the immense power that that second half of the chessboard gives us in these technologies. And also, we don't really have the emperor's rather neat way out. So we've got to learn to live with them. So, in this next section, I'd just like to stress that bad things do happen, and I want to give you 3 different examples. This is one of my favourite pictures. If I can just... There. That is not that the sea has come in right away across the east coast of the US. That's because they've had a power failure, right? It's gone dark. And what actually happened, you can actually see the Great Lakes there, for example. The Great Lakes are lurking here. What's actually happened is that a tree fell on a grid interconnector in Ohio. And not least because the grids are disparate in the US, they couldn't contain the failure. And it just failed its way across. The failure was not contained. It had some pretty major consequences. So let's just look at what happened. I suppose that slide demonstrates that human beings are no longer used to safely using candles. And there's a point in there about complete shutdown of cellular coverage that I want to come back to a bit later on. But it was significant. It didn't happen in isolation. In fact, the autumn of 2003 was a very bad time for power companies. Probably just about legible on that slide, but not just the US East Coast, but power cuts in London, in particular in the tube system at the height of the rush hour, which was pretty unhelpful. In the US again, they got hit by a hurricane in Virginia, major failures in Denmark and Sweden, and then the big one, a massive failure in Italy. And they took a very long time to recover that power failure in Italy because it required a black start of their grid from nothing. The term black start, and they couldn't do it. We want to come back to that a little bit later on. So, massive problems. But that's enough about power. Let's have a look at telecoms, my old industry. This is about a fire in a BT cable chamber in Manchester. Someone lifted a lid and chucked in some flammable liquid and a match. Whether they knew just how important that particular lid was is a matter for debate. But it took out the communications for 2 police forces, 1 ambulance service and a lot of banks. So all the cash dispensers stopped working. All those organisations thought they had bought communications from separate, different carriers, not just BT, that they were diversely routed, separate carriers. As it happened, they all went through the same manhole, and they all went down at the same time. I actually ended up, for various reasons, giving evidence to a parliamentary select committee, and alongside me was the Deputy Chief Constable of Derbyshire, who was kind of apoplectic about this, because they'd lost their police force comms, amongst other things. And he said that they were in serious fear of civil disorder. No police force comms, all the banks' cash dispensers stopped working, and so on. And they weren't far away from that, in his view. Let's pick another one. A little closer to home. The pitch review of the flooding. As many probably here know, key grid switching centres at Lorem and Castlemead were saved from flooding by some pretty heroic efforts, actually, the people on the ground, and by the fact that a set of flood defences which were destined for further up the River Severn got stuck on the M5 and were quickly sent to the grid centres. In more recent floods, a key railway signalling node had to be saved by barricades to keep First Great Western moving. There was a very important result of this, a government response to Pitt, and that was the establishment of the Natural Hazards Unit in the Cabinet Office, a significant step forward. So, you may say, that's all very well, but we've survived them all, so why worry now? Well, first, we've survived them on the back of some actually pretty good work done by the Cabinet Office Civil Contingencies Secretariat, CCS. Notably, some key exercises. One thing CCS did was to ask the grid companies and the power companies to run a black start exercise for the UK, the thing that our Italian friends failed so conspicuously at in practice. When they ran the exercise, they discovered the UK couldn't do a black start either. The reason was that last time they'd looked at this, we had lots of coal, and we could shovel the ruddy coal into the power station if necessary. By the time we got to here, we were using lots of gas. And the embarrassing thing about gas is you need to pump it. And guess what you use to pump it? Electrical power. So actually, the black start wasn't feasible with the planning they had. Happily, it is now. But it's one of those things you have to think through. So, importance of that was running realistic exercises, black starts. But I think more is needed. So let's look at the recommendations now of 3 key reports. This first one is an extract from the IPPR, Institute for Public Policy Research, Commission on National Security. I was a commissioner in that, and I confess this is my drafting. I mentioned earlier my worry about running lean and the guilt trip, and it's expressed in there. So I was then worried, and I'm still genuinely worried about cascades of failure across different parts of infrastructure. And that kind of sums it up. By the way, the Institute is going to make all of this available as a podcast with all the slides and everything else. So let's look at the 3 reports. It was a good summer, 2009, for reports. These 3 all came out at pretty much the same time. And it was clearly a good year, if you like, for having the drains up on infrastructure. One by the IPPR, one by the Prime Minister's Council on Science and Technology, and one by the Institution of Civil Engineers. All of them are available for download. Their recommendations were actually remarkably consistent. And I have to say, it's not a case of academic plagiarism. It's just similar analysis of the same challenges carried out in parallel at the same time. But I'd like to share with you, if I may, some extracts. As you can see from the fact that's recommendation number 52, the IPPR Commission made a rather large number of recommendations, and I've extracted some here of particular relevance. So, let's bring up the rest. The need for a degree of underpinning regulation, and I have to say I'm a free market person, but I believe there is a need for some underpinning regulation. As unguided, markets in infrastructure are unlikely to deliver the required outcome. Second point, that regulators actually need to talk to each other and support each other. Let me give you an example. When I was spectrum regulator, which was in the mid-1990s, the power companies were thinking about renewing their communications. They had what were then called private mobile radio from big hilltop sites with big backup generators under their own control. But it was expensive and it was getting obsolete. So they went to Ofgem and said, we'd like you to give us regulatory relief on the capex we're going to spend on renewing this communications. And Ofgem said, not on your life. You're supposed to spend money on power, not on communications. And so what it did was to drive many of the companies into the arms of the mobile operators. There's just one slight snag. If you lose the power grid, you lose the mobile operator. So just exactly how you're going to get it back might be challenging. If you ask the power companies, they'll say, well, we have got some satellite phones, a few. Right? So this is the sort of loop that I'm worried we're getting into here. Then the final one was that actually that smart meters and smart grids might be an accident waiting to happen. Just to share with you an early example of that, happily it's better now, but the early DEC Ofgem specs for smart meters were really great fun if you were a security person, because they had no concept of security whatsoever. The meters were designed to update each other peer-to-peer. Right? We'll come back to that. Furthermore, there was a remote turn-off capability to turn somebody off power if they hadn't paid their bill without the trouble of having to go to their premises. But there was no remote turn-on. So as a hacker, I could hack one meter, have it update every other meter in the country, and then order them all to turn off. And you wouldn't be able to get them back without truck-rolling every property in the country. This suggests someone wasn't thinking very clearly. That point was made fairly forcibly and fairly repeatedly by a number of professional bodies, and the situation is better now, but I'm still not entirely convinced they've thought through the security of smart meters. We shall see. What was the final one there? Yeah. That was the smart metering one. Sorry. Let's go on to the Prime Minister's Council. Let's bring all these up. They highlighted ageing infrastructure, and that infrastructure was designed in a pre-internet, pre-hacking, much less malign world. So you can't really blame people how it was designed. It was designed in a different era. Also, the interdependence and thus a potential for what is termed accidental systems, and we'll come back to that again. Capacity limitations, which have been fairly much in the news of late. That clearly hasn't gone away in the last 4 years. And it's worth noting in passing that actually any strategy that I've seen that's realistic about climate change involves large amounts of carbon capture and storage. And whilst a great deal of work has been done on that at university level, you'd be hard pushed to find any real examples of it actually out in the wild on an industrial scale. But actually, we desperately need it if we're going to respond to this. Perhaps something for question time. Let's go on to the third report. This was the Institution of Civil Engineers. And they highlighted a need for coordination, and arguably that may now have been partly implemented through the creation of Infrastructure UK. Again, this stress on the role of regulators, this touching faith in gentle guidance. I'm afraid, having been a regulator, I don't have a lot of faith in gentle guidance. Regulators are driven by their legislation. And even the government in its response, the previous government's response to the Pitt Review, noted that it might be necessary to have new primary legislation, which of course they couldn't commit to in any kind of sensible timescale. We are going to need to have new primary legislation here to actually direct the regulators to cooperate with each other. I'll give you one example I'm familiar with, and that is with Ofcom. Ofcom was set up with a very strong set of legislative varies to support the citizen consumer, which is a good thing. I bet the power regulator wishes that too. But because of that, it's distorted their response to industry, because there's not an equivalent directive in there to support innovation, for example, anything like the same strength. And in the end, they're driven by their legislation. So there is more work to do here. I've kept mentioning this phrase, accidental systems. And what I mean by that is systems we didn't design, systems we didn't intend, but may nonetheless come back to bite us. And I'd like to just give you some examples of that. This is a case study. It's based around the Royal Academy of Engineering's Global Navigation Space Systems report. By the way, Chris will forgive me. It was Chris Coulter from the Academy sitting here. But actually, this is the most wonderful proofreading error, because I was a member of the team that wrote this, and none of us spotted the error on the front page. It was meant to be Global Navigation Satellite Systems, which is what GNSS actually stands for. So the only typo in the report I know about is actually on the front page. But never mind. That's life. This was authored in 2011. And the point this report was making is that GPS is a very, very nice solution. It's backed by the distinct advantage that the transmissions are free. On that basis, it's become a key dependency of many, many different systems in many, many different sectors. So I'd like just to share with you what the Academy found. So it found use across a wide range of sectors and a wide range of applications. But they all depend on signals from the GPS satellite clusters. So another look. This actually illustrates it rather better. What you have is some key dependencies in the power grids, some key dependencies in banking and indeed in stock exchanges. All that high frequency trading we hear about is timed to perfection from GPS. All sorts of issues in transportation. I'm going to look at that in more detail, and in the communications networks as well. Now, please don't let me mislead you. There are alternatives for most of these. There are backups if GPS fails. But in most cases, they're backups for a period of time. They're backups which degrade over time. So, for example, in the communication systems that we see here, these require, modern digital comm systems require very delicate synchronization. If that synchronization starts to drift apart because you're now running on local clocks, they gradually lose capacity. And the beauty of GPS has been the global synchronization it provides from that source. So there's an issue, but also not everything is backed up. So let's just have a look at what that means. I should actually say to the problem of failure, we also add deliberate jamming. And if, for example, we were mad enough to use GPS for road tolling, I can guarantee an entire black market in jammers virtually overnight. It's not beyond the power. Well, any decent electrical engineering graduate student can make a GPS jammer very quickly. And what's already a nuisance would become a complete disaster overnight. That's an interesting policy implication. Let's whiz through these. The key concerns about GPS, you might say, but hang on a minute, it's not just GPS. There's GLONASS from Russia. There's our European system Galileo, if we ever get it launched. There's even a Chinese system. Yes, but they all share one common vulnerability, and that's to space weather, which is something that the Royal Academy of Engineering managed to get onto the government's risk register a couple of years ago. I don't know if anyone in this room is familiar with a thing called a Carrington event. You don't have to be, because the last time we had a Carrington event was in 1859. But if we had one today, it would be really serious. In the Carrington event, there's a mass ejection from the sun, a coronal mass ejection, and the geometry is just right that it hits the Earth head-on, and it hits it with just the right orientation of magnetic field. If it does, it introduces immense currents into any kind of long metal infrastructure on the ground, and the enhanced radiation will take out all your satellites. So at one blow, you could take out all of the GPS constellations, not just Galileo, not just GPS. And by the way, it might cause a fair amount of grief on the ground as well. There was a lovely New Scientist headline about 3 years ago, which was how to transform the US into a third world country in 90 seconds. Anyhow. So to add to that, by the last time this happened, of course, was the telegraph age. And a fair number of telegraph operators were electrocuted with the currents that were induced. And there were fires. But we didn't use much in those days. Right? We await when there'll be the next one. Estimates vary. Probably a 1 in 200 year event. Right. So, and we could add to that jamming and we could add to that false signals. But I'd like to look at an example in maritime navigation. This is the work of an unsung, but I think particularly excellent and far-sighted body, which no one will ever have heard of, called the General Lighthouse Authorities. Right? But they're good. They recognise the vulnerability of GPS and the fact that actually GPS doesn't actually meet the IMO's navigation systems resiliency requirement, which everyone conveniently ignores. And so our friends in the General Lighthouse Authorities came up with a solution. Let me share it with you. Oh, sorry, let me come back to this one. What they'd done was they went back to some old pre-satellite age navigation systems called Lorem C, which was a medium frequency terrestrial system. Virtually all the Lorem C stations have now been decommissioned because GPS is so much cheaper. You don't have to maintain them. But what the Lighthouse Authority did was to work out how to build, if you like, a LORAN for the 21st century, which they called eLORAN, with roughly the same accuracy as GPS, both for position and timing. But the technology is completely independent. It's a terrestrial system, not a satellite system. And so they ran some tests off Sunderland, with appropriate warnings to the seafarers, I have to say. So they ran some deliberate jamming of GPS in a cone out to sea. And they sailed a Trinity House ship into it to see what happened. And what you can see on there, statically, for example, is actually the position indicated. Sorry, I'll get this to work. The green position is where it actually is. The blue position here is where the GPS was indicating it was. So quite a difference. Then they stepped up the power. So let's see what happens then. So at low power, the positions indicated by GPS were what are known in the trade as hazardously misleading. So there's no indication of unreliability. As they increased the power, the crew might have worked out there was a problem because it indicated the ship was doing more than Mach 1 and it was in the middle of Norway. But the problem is the hazardously misleading ones. So let's look. I just want to share with you how many systems on that ship they discovered were dependent on GPS. These are all ones that failed as the power went up. You lost the electronic chart display, perhaps not surprising. The ship's autopilot shut down. The differential GPS navigation failed. The helideck stabilization system packed in. The distress system packed in. The radar packed in because it was taking timing off GPS. The gyro compass failed, and so on. One of the things that worried even Trinity House was the fact the bridge crew were hit with a huge number of alarms from disparate systems. And even though they knew what they were doing, they were completely disorientated by this. Interesting. So, not a happy situation. So, as I indicated earlier, the UK had developed an alternative, eLORAN, to walk alongside GPS. In 2011, it was teetering on the edge of being shut down for lack of funding. I'd like to think, and it's probably true, that the Academy's report helped to get it funded. A Trinity House press release from this summer was entitled UK Speeds Ahead with Rollout of eLORAN to Back Up Vulnerable GPS. Noted the Department of Transport approves implementation of 7 differential eLORAN stations along the UK coastline. And others are being built in Europe. Other countries are interested too. You can integrate eLORAN into GPS chipsets, and you've solved a problem. But it's one example of what I'm concerned about. Just push on. So, we can identify and act to mitigate accidental systems, but too much of our infrastructure is outdated and designed long before security was an issue. So let's look at a cautionary tale from the USA. This video I'm going to show you fell out of the back of the security service, but I'm assured by the service, or Centre for Protection of National Infrastructure, this particular vulnerability is not present in the UK. I just want to share with you. So much of the underpinning in power, much of the underpinning systems called scanning, control and data acquisition, SCADA, were designed for a different age. What actually happened here was a chap approached Homeland Security in the US and said, you do realise that I could park a truck outside one of your power plants, I could then hack into the SCADA systems, I could take the main generator offline when it's under load, and drop it back online again in anti-phase to the grid so it wrecks itself, don't you? To which Homeland Security said, no, you can't. To which he said, well, would you like me to demonstrate? And so this video is a video of the demonstration, which was held in a carefully controlled thing out in the deepest of the Midwest. Let me just see if I can make it work. Next slide. Now, what I never tried to do is do this. Actually, I may have to do it. That's it. Ah, it's working. Think, please. Play. Better yet, play up there. So I've got to get my mouse onto this screen as opposed to the screen that I'm using. Oh, yeah. Now, he's about to drop the generator off and onto line again. Right. A couple of times. A few bits dropping off it. The next one that really does it. And shortly after that, there's a large plume of black smoke. And that's the end of our generator. The video has an interesting history. It got released on a bad office day for someone in Homeland Security. So it does come with a header that says not to be released. It got out onto the internet. They made very strenuous efforts to retrieve it, of which they were not entirely successful. Hence what you've just seen. But it does make the point really rather graphically. So that was done by radio hacking of a power system. So let's just move on. Those vulnerabilities don't have to exist. I can see James Davenport sitting here. He knows this stuff better than I do. But there are innumerable reports on how to write good and secure software. Some are from the Academy. Some are from the US National Security Agency. It can be done. We know how to do it. We just typically don't, which is a bit of a shame. So we need to come back to that a bit later on too. So I just want to move on to, is there a good understanding of resilience? So this is a little bit of research I did with the Institute of Directors a few years ago. It's good research. It was done by GfK NOP. The first time I tried to use them, they took one look at my research questionnaire, held it at arm's length and sniffed, and said very clearly, you're not used to writing these, are you? And showed me how to write a proper research questionnaire that didn't lead the witness, shall we say. Anyhow, so this was a proper research questionnaire. It didn't lead the witness. That just shows you the nature of the sample. So a lot of smaller companies in the IOD, but actually quite a leavening, 15% of 501 plus employees. This was one of the questions. So on a scale of 1 to 7, where 7 would imply complete shutdown of your operation, would you please assess the impact of a failure of supply of one of the following pieces of infrastructure on your business? And what I've done here is, I do have slides of all of these in detail, but this is the impact that was thought. So I can lose gas supply, it doesn't really have much impact. The one that really does start to hurt me is electrical power. I have a feeling that's actually slightly more important than this slide shows. And also fixed comms. And that's probably fair, but I think all that underestimates the impact. But the killer was the next one. So, in an emergency that involves loss of electrical power for 12 hours over a wide area, would you expect to be able to continue to use the following pieces of infrastructure? The interdependency question. And this is the one they got dead wrong to a man and a woman. They were absolutely convinced that whatever happened for 12 hours in the power industry wouldn't affect their mobile phone one jot. Sorry, that will go down almost immediately. It's not that there aren't protected nodes in the mobile systems, there are. The big macro nodes have loads of power and backup and all the rest of it, but they don't carry much of the traffic. The traffic is carried by smaller modes with no backup power, and when you lose them, you just flatten the whole network because it can't handle the traffic. Right? So, dead wrong. Amusingly, they thought they wouldn't be able to use their fixed voice and data, which they probably would. So if you're a small business and you're planning your business continuity on this basis, you're getting it 100% wrong. So that's an interesting policy challenge. I also think they might have been a bit wrong about water supply and sewage, but let's not go there. we're coming to the end now, I promise, but I want to just talk about what we might do about some of this. So this is about creating markets in resilience. I should stress, I think we do need some regulation here, but that may be more difficult because it requires primary legislation. But actually, we quite often solve problems by making money out of them. And I think that's clearly applicable to the comms and water industries, which are untapped markets and may have further potential in power and gas. So let's have a look. This is my hypothesis. You see, I think that there is a huge market for a mobile comm system, if you like, a cellular network, which was resilient against power failure, at least for 24 hours, ideally 72, and resilient against overload. Technically, it's not that difficult to do, but we don't have it. So I went around the mobile manufacturers, mobile companies saying, well, hang on a minute, there's probably 2 million customers here, or 1.8 million to be precise, which you could charge. Lurking, for example, in transport, storage and communications are all the broadcasters. Here you've got all the utilities. Key financial institutions probably want it, some aspects of manufacturing, and so on, certainly in defence. Why won't you do it? Well, the reason is, of course, the market thinks we are resilient. We don't want to tell them we're not. So we have another interesting market failure here, which is about lack of understanding in the marketplace. Interestingly, this may get resolved because the blue light services are out for a new network. And the blue light services need a network which is resilient against power failure. Wide coverage is not going to collapse in a heap with an overload of traffic. And the very sensible thing would be not only to have that, but to ride all this lot on the back of it as well. We shall see. But the one thing you need, as I said earlier, if you have a major grid failure, you really, really want to have your communications working, particularly if it's mobile communications out in the field trying to get it back. The reason the Italians took days to get their Black Start done was they'd lost their comms. So they couldn't communicate between the power stations. Okay. I won't dwell on this, but it's actually quite simple to engineer. All you do, you don't equip every picocell and microcell with power. You use the macrocells, but some here will remember that we never actually, didn't design into mobile phones texting for any particular reason other than as an engineer's interface. It turned out to be hugely popular. Well, there are engineering interfaces for quality of service too. So you've got a quality of service cut-off to drive through anything else. So there are ways of doing this. You base it on 4G technology. Whether you carve it out, well, we can have a debate about that. So, what's the charging model? Well, I think you sell it just like a normal cellular device, but with resilience. And in particular, you probably have an enhanced rental charge. But to do it, you'd need support from those sector regulators to say, hang on a minute, there's no point in investing in the power if you can't communicate to get it back up. So this requires a sort of holistic approach, which we haven't been having. Now, so how do we break out of all of this? Well, at the moment, we're busy looking at our infrastructure, redesigning it. We could choose now to enhance it. We could choose to harden it. We could do it using, these are relatively simple systems. We could do it with software based on formal methods, where we know it is correct mathematically. We don't have to test it correct, which you can't do, by the way. You don't have to. It is formally proven. We could do that. And let's just say there are plenty of things we could do here. We might pick it up in questions. So how might we achieve that breakout? We could take the infrastructure projects. We could also mandate 2 stages of procurement, where you have a systems architect that looks at this, something that was sadly missing in the smart metering project, to look at it as a complete system. You could demand that the operational software was always delivered with evidence that it works. You might even, in a simple way, think about product liability, which really puts the fear into the software industry. But the point is, you've got to rely far more on analysis rather than testing. back to that IPPR report. I must confess this is again one of my pieces. One thing we could do today, we could, in this case we're suggesting the European Community might sponsor a programme of creating a range of secure and reliable standard software modules, basic operating systems for process control, basic user interfaces, not Windows. This is not complicated stuff. We could do it with 4 methods, we could do it with open source, and we could give it away. You want at least 2, so you don't want a single source here. You build them, you give them away, and then all the folk in process control can put their own stuff on top. They might well be able to ruin it, but at least they're ruining it off a secure base. That one sank without trace. We might want to revisit it. So, I'm coming to the end. Let me just sum up with some final thoughts. This is the government's cybersecurity vision, of course. To tackle the UK cybercrime, a secure place in the world, more resilient to cyber attacks, open, stable, vibrant cyberspace, cross-cutting skills. There is a big problem with the government's cybersecurity strategy and the £650 million it pumped into it, most of which has been spent on exotic hardware. It should have been spent on basic training in cyber literacy, in cyber hygiene, for everyone in the UK. Because there are those in this room who could design a very secure system, I could, and I know it can be defeated by a user who doesn't understand what it's meant to do and will override it. So much of what we're looking at here isn't about technology, and I say that with regret as a technologist. It's actually about human beings. And any really good cyber attack these days isn't all about the technology. It's about what's known in the trade as social engineering, which is bribery and corruption. Social engineering sounds so much better. So we have some real issues here. So, we've got some risks. I always rather liked Goethe's comments on risk. And also, Machiavelli wasn't bad on it either. And perhaps this is very pertinent to the problem of changing the way we regulate, changing the whole basis of the software that we use, and so on. But of course, actually, business without risk is like farming without water. So risk is something, certainly in the private sector, we're very used to identifying and within reason managing. So, I just want to point out that these are actually all key responsibilities of the board of any private sector company. So cyber risk is steadily growing. You've got to have a proper risk assessment. You've got to identify the risks. You've got to be holistic. And so, for example, almost no organisations that I know have an information asset register. What information do they hold? What information do they want to hold? What information should they quickly destroy? Because it's a toxic asset, not a liability, not a benefit. And so organisations end up protecting everything badly, whereas there's just a few pieces of crown jewels they ought to protect. And much of the rest of it doesn't actually matter. So, interesting thought. Nearly there. So, I want to come back to the point the UK is actually pretty good in this space. It's got a really good history of voluntary coordination, trust information sharing. Telecoms industry is particularly good at this. Doesn't apply to many other countries, which is interesting. Electrical power and comms have the key roles in either creating or blocking the cascades of failure that really worry me. Long ago, mobile comms ceased to be a sort of rich businessman's toy, which was how we conceived of it in the early 1990s. It's actually now more important than fixed. But it was never designed to be resilient or secure. That wasn't what we were trying to do. Maybe the mobile operators are missing an opportunity here. There's also opportunities, if you like, to differentiate your tariff by the resilience you offer. And that may well apply across a range of utilities. And I think will inevitably happen. You can start to see it in communications now. With BT Broadband, which I personally use, you can either have option 1, which means that whenever it gets busy they turn you down, or option 3, which means they don't turn you down. Now that's tariffing by quality of service. It's very simple. You know, perhaps we should be honest about that. And it probably applies to a lot of other things. One last example. I used to be Senior Independent Director of a high-tech semiconductor manufacturer based in the UK, until it was actually bought in a takeover bid by the Americans. But whilst we were running it, I had a hate-hate relationship with United Utilities, because 4 times in 1 year they cut off our water supply without warning. For the best of motives, they were doing maintenance that should have been done for the last 20 years, and they were now getting around to doing it. But they cut us off. If we did that, for health and safety reasons, if you're not getting it back within 15 minutes, you have to shut the plant and dump all the work in progress. £250,000 a time. Right? And they wouldn't tell us when they were going to cut off the water supply. We'd have paid a premium, just not to waste £1 million every year. You know? No, we can't do that. So yeah, we're missing some tricks here, where market forces ought to complement regulation. So, what I would just say, the slides for this you can download. Also, they will be put together by the Academy, by the Institute, along with a recording and so on. So, that's it. I was asked to speak 45 minutes. It's 44 minutes and 52 seconds. So I think I'm pretty close. And I'd be very happy to take your questions, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.